I am Grace, and I just turned 31 years old. On the night of my birthday, while I was sitting alone with a single candle on a small chocolate cupcake, my father Arthur stood at my doorstep and handed me an envelope that would systematically dismantle every memory I held dear. He had not stepped foot in my apartment for 4 years. He stood there in a cashmere coat that cost more than my annual rent, and looked at my humble living space with a sneer before delivering a blow that I will carry to my grave. He said, "Your grandmother Beatrice left this for you, but do not get your hopes up. She died believing you would amount to nothing, and she told me she was ashamed of the life you chose." The weight of those words felt like a physical strike to my chest. My grandmother was the only person who had ever truly seen me, but when I retreated inside and opened that brittle yellowed envelope, my heart stopped. The first line of the handwritten letter did not contain shame. It said, "If you are reading this, it means you survived your parents. I knew you would." Inside that envelope was a small cold brass key and a series of instructions that revealed a secret hidden for 6 years. It was a secret that changed everything I thought I knew about my father, my brother Julian, and the inheritance I was told I did not deserve. Before I tell you the rest of this story, if you find this journey worth hearing, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely want to hear more. Also, I would love to connect with you in the comments. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? I read every single comment, and it means the world to me. Now let me take you back to 6 years ago, to the funeral of Beatrice Sterling, because that is where the web of lies was first spun. The funeral home smelled like a suffocating mixture of lilies and old money. My grandmother Beatrice lay in a mahogany casket that was polished to a mirror shine, surrounded by white roses that looked like they belonged in a royal garden. My father Arthur stood at the center of the room, like a king receiving tribute, rather than a son in mourning. Every time he reached out to shake a business partner's hand, his Patek Philippe watch caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, reminding everyone in the room exactly how much power he wielded. I stood in the far corner, essentially invisible. My stepmother Evelyn floated through the crowd in a black silk dress, playing the part of the grieving daughter-in-law to perfection. She spent the entire afternoon guiding my half-brother Julian around the room. Julian was 20, then just home for the summer from his prestigious Ivy League university. "This is Julian," Evelyn would tell the guests, her voice dripping with pride. He was Beatrice's favorite grandson, the light of her life. No one introduced me. I was 25 years old, working at a wildlife rescue center for a salary that my father considered a joke. In the eyes of the Sterling family, I was the disappointment, the daughter who chose messy animals over a corporate career. 2 weeks after we laid her to rest, we gathered in a downtown law office for the reading of the will. The room was filled with dark wood and heavy leather chairs. Arthur sat at the head of the long table, looking like he already owned the building. Julian and Evelyn sat flanking him, like heirs to a throne, while I was tucked away at the very end of the table near the exit. The attorney, a young man who looked terrified to even look Arthur in the eye, began to read. I remember the silence in that room. I remember the way my father nodded with practiced solemnity as the lawyer reached the main sections. To my son, Arthur Sterling, the lawyer read, "I leave 95% of my estate to be managed and distributed among family members at his sole discretion." And then came my name. To my granddaughter, Grace Sterling, I leave the sum of $15,000 to be used toward the purchase of a safe and reliable vehicle. $15,000. In a family worth tens of millions, it was a calculated insult. Evelyn reached over and squeezed my hand with a look of pity that felt like a slap. "That is so sweet of her, Grace," she whispered. "She just wanted you to be safe on the roads." I could not speak. I left that office believing that the woman who used to call me her little star, the woman who taught me to read and let me live with her for 2 years after my own mother died, had looked at my life and found me wanting. I believed her love was conditional and that I had failed the test. For 6 years, I carried that shame like a heavy stone. I lived in a tiny 35 square meter studio apartment and drove a beat-up car while watching from the sidelines as Arthur funded Julian's lavish lifestyle. I watched Julian get a brand new European sports car and heard stories of the six-figure investments Arthur was making in Julian's future. I was the forgotten daughter until the night of my 31st birthday, when that knock at the door changed everything. After Arthur left my apartment on my birthday, I sat at my small kitchen table and read the rest of Beatrice's secret letter. My hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. My sweet girl, the letter continued. I need you to understand that I have never, not for one single day, believed you were anything less than extraordinary. If your father told you otherwise, he was lying. He lies about many things. It is a habit he learned long ago, and one I failed to break in him. The letter explained that the key in my hand belonged to a private safe deposit box at the central bank, box number 1582. Beatrice had named me as the sole authorized person to access it. Not Arthur, not Evelyn, only me. Inside, she promised I would find the real documents, the real will, and the proof of a legacy they had tried to steal from me. She had hidden these papers with a different attorney, a woman named Penelope, who had been her secret confidant. As I sat there in the dim light of my apartment, the reality of the betrayal began to sink in. My father had not just been cold, he had been predatory. He had stolen my grandmother's true final wishes and replaced them with a version that served his own greed. He had spent years making me feel worthless while he pocketed the security my grandmother had intended for me. The brass key felt cold and heavy in my palm. It was more than just metal, it was a weapon. It was the key to my freedom and the evidence of a crime that would soon bring the House of Sterling crashing down. I did not sleep that night. I just sat there staring at the letter, waiting for the sun to rise so I could go to the bank and see exactly how deep the betrayal went. The morning after I found that letter, I didn't go to work. I sat in my car outside the central bank, clutching the brass key until it left a deep red imprint on my palm. My mind kept drifting back 6 years. Back to the day that was supposed to be a final goodbye, but turned into the beginning of a long, cold shadow. To understand the weight of the betrayal I felt, you have to understand the funeral of Beatrice Sterling. The Sterling Funeral Home was a place where grief was sanitized and polished until it shone. It smelled of heavy, suffocating lilies and the crisp ozone scent of expensive air conditioning. My grandmother lay in a mahogany casket that probably cost more than the annual budget of the Wildlife Rescue Center where I worked. She looked peaceful, surrounded by white roses that looked like they had been sculpted from marble. But the peace ended at the edge of her casket. My father, Arthur, was in his element. He wasn't grieving, he was networking. He stood in the center of the foyer in a bespoke black suit, shaking hands with CEOs and city council members. Every time he reached out to clasp a shoulder, the light from the crystal chandeliers would catch his Patek Philippe watch, a brilliant, mocking flash of gold. "Thank you for coming," he would say with practiced solemnity. Mother would have appreciated the support for the firm. He spoke as if her life had been nothing more than a long-term marketing strategy for the family business. I watched him from the shadows of a large floral arrangement. I felt invisible, a ghost haunting my own family's mourning. My stepmother, Evelyn, moved through the crowd like a silk-clad predator, her hand perpetually resting on the shoulder of my half-brother Julian. He was 20 then, back from his first year at a prestigious university, looking every bit the golden heir. "This is Julian," Evelyn would announce to anyone who would listen, her voice a saccharine trill. Beatrice's pride and joy. She simply adored him. She always said he was the future of the Sterling legacy. No one introduced me. I was 25, wearing a dress I'd bought on sale, my hands still rough from a week of rehabilitating injured hawks. In their eyes, I was the daughter who had gone rogue, the one who chose a messy, low-paying passion over the polished corridors of power. I was the family disappointment, a living reminder of Arthur's failed first marriage. But as I stood there, I kept thinking about the summers in Vermont. After my mother died when I was 12, my father had dropped me off at Beatrice's colonial house, claiming he needed space to process his grief. That space lasted 2 years, and they were the only years I felt truly alive. Beatrice didn't care about corporate ladders. She made me pancakes shaped like stars. She read me adventure novels by the fireplace, doing all the voices until I doubled over laughing. She was the one who told me that my mother was brave and that I carried that same fire inside me. "Don't let them dim your light, Grace," she would whisper while tucking me in. "You are my little star." When Arthur remarried and brought me back to the city, I was tucked away in the smallest room of the new house, a cramped space next to the garage. I became an afterthought, while Julian's every milestone was celebrated with gala-sized parties. Still, I believed Beatrice was my sanctuary. I believed she saw the truth. 2 weeks after we buried her, we gathered for the reading of the will. The law office was located in a towering glass building downtown, filled with dark wood paneling and heavy leather chairs that seemed designed to make you feel small. Arthur sat at the head of the long conference table, leaning back like a king presiding over his court. Julian and Evelyn sat to his right, looking expectant. I sat at the very end, near the heavy oak door, feeling like an intruder. The attorney, a man named Mr. Henderson, looked incredibly nervous. He kept adjusting his glasses and glancing at my father, who met his gaze with a terrifyingly calm expression. When Henderson began to read, his voice wavered. I don't remember the technical jargon about real estate holdings or charitable foundations. What I remember is the moment the air left the room. "To my son, Arthur Sterling," Henderson read, "I leave 95% of my liquid assets and all controlling shares of Sterling Holdings to be managed and distributed among family members at his sole discretion." Arthur didn't even blink. He just gave a slow, satisfied nod. Then came my name. "To my granddaughter, Grace Sterling, I leave the sum of $15,000 with the specific intent that it be used toward the purchase of a safe and reliable vehicle." $15,000. In a family that measured success in 7 and 8 figures, it was a public execution of my character. It was Beatrice telling the world and telling me that I wasn't worth the investment. Evelyn reached over the table and squeezed my hand, her eyes swimming with a pity that felt like poison. "It's so thoughtful, Grace," she whispered. "She knew you struggled with that old car. She just wanted you to be safe." I couldn't even look at her. I looked at my father. He wasn't looking at me. He was already discussing investment strategies for Julian's portion with the attorney. He had a smile on his face. Not a smile of happiness, but one of victory. "Mother always had a keen sense of what people deserved," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I signed the papers they pushed in front of me. I shook the attorney's hand with numb fingers. I walked out of that office and into a 6-year winter. I lived in a tiny studio apartment, driving a used sedan, and every time I struggled to pay a bill, I felt the crushing weight of that $15,000. I believed that the only person who had ever loved me had looked at my life and found it worthless. I believed I was a failure, because that's what the will said. But sitting in my car 6 years later, staring at the brass key and the letter that said I knew you would survive them, the cold began to crack. I realized that the Henderson I remembered, the one who couldn't look me in the eye, hadn't been nervous. He had been guilty. Arthur hadn't been satisfied. He had been triumphant in a heist. They had stolen my grandmother's voice and replaced it with a lie designed to keep me small. But they had forgotten one thing. Beatrice Sterling was smarter than all of them, and she had left me a way to fight back. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the look of triumph on my father's face from 6 years ago. I saw my stepmother Evelyn's pitying smile and heard the dismissive way Julian talked about his future as if it were a birthright he had earned. The brass key sat on my nightstand, catching the moonlight, and it felt like a heavy anchor in a storm of memories. If you have ever been made to feel small by the very people who were supposed to protect you, then you know exactly why I was standing outside the bank doors before they even opened the next morning. If this story is hitting home for you, or if you have ever had to fight for the respect you were owed, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It helps make sure that stories of resilience reach the people who need them most. And tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered a secret that changed your entire perspective on your family? I want to know your stories, because here we are, a community that believes no one should have to walk through the shadows alone. The central bank was one of those old stone buildings that felt like it had been guarding secrets since the turn of the century. It had high vaulted ceilings and marble floors that echoed with every step I took. I walked up to the front desk with my driver's license and the key. My voice was a whisper as I told the clerk I needed to access Safe Deposit Box 1582. The clerk, a young man in a crisp suit, typed the number into his computer, and then he froze. He typed it again and looked up at me with a strange expression. He did not say a word, he just stood up and went into a back office. 10 minutes later, a man in his mid-50s with graying temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses approached me. He introduced himself as Thomas Caldwell, the branch manager. "Miss Sterling," he said with a voice that was hushed and respectful, "please follow me to my office." Once we were inside and the door was closed, he looked at me for a long time. "I have been waiting for this day for 6 years," he said. "Your grandmother Beatrice was a very dear friend of mine. She opened this box in 2021, just a few months before she passed. She was very specific about the instructions. No one else was to be allowed access. Not your father, Arthur, and certainly not his lawyers." Thomas leaned forward, and his voice softened with emotion. "She told me something that I have been holding on to for you, Grace. She said when my granddaughter comes, and she will come tell her I never stopped believing in her. Not for one single day. She knew what they would try to do. She knew how they would try to make you feel." I felt the tears finally break and slide down my face. For 6 years, I had lived in a world where I thought my grandmother had died disappointed in me. Thomas led me through a heavy steel door and down a corridor lined with hundreds of small metal boxes until we reached number 1582. He turned his half of the key, I turned mine, and he left me alone in the small private vault room. The box was larger than I expected. Inside was a thick manila folder and a leather portfolio embossed with the name of a law firm I had never heard of. I sat down on the small wooden bench and pulled out the first document. It was titled, "Last Will and Testament of Beatrice Sterling, executed June 10th, 2021. This was months after the version my father had read in the law office. As I scanned the legal language, the world seemed to stop spinning. "To my granddaughter, Grace Sterling, I bequeath my education trust fund, currently valued at $3.5 million, and my property located on the coast of Oregon, currently valued at $1.2 million, $4.7 million. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. My grandmother had not left me $15,000 for a car. She had left me a fortune and the house where we had spent our happiest summers. But then I saw the second part of the will. To my son, Arthur Sterling, I leave the sum of $50,000 and the hope that he will one day realize that money cannot buy a daughter's love or a mother's respect." My heart hammered against my ribs. My father had committed fraud. He had taken a superseded will from 5 years prior and presented it as the truth while hiding this document from the court. But the betrayal went even deeper. At the bottom of the folder, I found bank statements for the trust fund. There were dozens of unauthorized withdrawals, totaling over $450,000. The dates were unmistakable. Every time Julian had a tuition payment due at his Ivy League school, or every time Arthur needed to inject capital into his failing real estate projects, money was siphoned out of my trust. They had not just lied to me, they had been stealing from me for years. They had used my grandmother's legacy to fund the very people who looked down on me. Julian's sports car, his expensive suits, his elite education were all paid for with money that belonged to me. My father had stood in my apartment just 24 hours ago telling me I was a failure while he was holding a wallet stuffed with my inheritance. The clear, cold weight of reality settled over me. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the evidence of their crimes. At the very bottom of the portfolio, I found a handwritten note from Beatrice. My little star, it said, "I know the path has been lonely. I know they have tried to make you believe you are small. But a star is only small when seen from a distance. Up close, you are a sun. You are bright and you are powerful. I have left everything in the hands of Penelope, my lawyer and friend. Go to her. Show her these papers. Do not be afraid to take back what is yours. The truth has a way of finding the light, and you are the one who will carry the torch. I packed everything back into the folder and walked out of that bank vault. I didn't feel like the woman who had walked in. The Grace who entered that bank was a woman haunted by shame and inadequacy. The Grace who walked out was a woman who was done being quiet. I had the brass key, I had the truth, and I had a legacy that was worth more than any amount of money. I had my grandmother's faith in me. As I stepped out into the bright morning sun, the city didn't look so intimidating anymore. I knew exactly where I was going next. I was going to find Penelope, and then I was going to give my father exactly what he deserved. He thought he had buried the truth with Beatrice, but he had forgotten that she was the one who taught me how to fight. The silence inside Vault Room 1582 was absolute, the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. I sat on the small wooden bench, the manila folder resting on my lap like a lead weight. My hands, still rough from a morning of cleaning bird enclosures at the rescue center, looked out of place against the pristine, cream-colored legal paper. For 6 years, I had walked through the world believing I was a footnote in my family's history, a minor character who hadn't earned a place in her grandmother's heart. But as I flipped open the first page of the document inside, the world didn't just shift, it shattered. The document was titled Last Will and Testament of Beatrice Sterling, and the date at the bottom stopped my breath, March 15, 2021. This was executed only months before she passed. My mind raced back to that mahogany-paneled office 6 years ago, where my father, Arthur, had sat like a king while a nervous attorney read a version of this same document dated from 2016. In that version, I was a charity case, gifted $15,000 for a used car. But here, in the dim, hushed light of the bank vault, the truth was written in black and white. To my granddaughter, Grace Sterling, I bequeath the following. My primary education trust fund, currently valued at $3.5 million, and my coastal property in Oregon, currently valued at $1.2 million, $4.7 million. I stared at the numbers until they blurred into unrecognizable shapes. The Oregon house, the colonial with the wraparound porch where Beatrice had taught me that I was brave, was mine. For years, Arthur had told the family that the house had been sold to cover estate taxes and grandmother's medical bills. He had made me feel guilty for even asking to visit it one last time, telling me I was being sentimental and impractical while he was busy saving the family legacy. He hadn't sold it. He had stolen it. I kept reading, my eyes scanning the legal jargon until I found the section regarding my father. To my son, Arthur Sterling, I leave the sum of $50,000 and the sincere hope that he will one day understand that family is not a business to be managed, but a garden to be tended. The contrast was staggering. In the fake will Arthur had presented to the probate court, he was the executor of 95% of the estate. In the real will, he was practically disinherited. Beatrice had seen right through his polished suits and his Patek Philippe watches. She had known exactly who he was. But then I reached the bank statements tucked at the back of the folder, and the shock turned into a cold, sharp fury. These weren't just records. They were a map of a crime. Starting exactly 1 month after the funeral, the withdrawals began. They were large, systematic, and timed with surgical precision. September 2021, $85,000 withdrawn from the Grace Sterling Trust. That was the same month Julian started his MBA program at that elite university. September 2022, $82,000. May 2023, $150,000, noted as a business investment for Sterling Properties, LLC. The total was over $450,000. Nearly $500,000 of my grandmother's legacy, money meant to give me a life of security and passion, had been siphoned off to fund Julian's lifestyle and bail out my father's failing real estate projects. Every time I had seen Julian driving his new European sports car, every time I had heard Arthur brag about his company's aggressive expansion, they were doing it with my blood and Beatrice's love. I remember a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago when I was struggling to pay for a transmission repair on my old car. I had timidly asked Arthur for a small loan, and he had laughed that dismissive, hollow laugh of his. He told me that if I wanted big girl money, I should have chosen a big girl career instead of playing with animals. Julian had sat across from me, sipping a vintage wine that probably cost $500 a bottle, looking at me with a pity that I now realized was actually a mask for his own unearned privilege. They knew. They both knew that my poverty was a choice they had made for me. I laid the bank statements out on the vault bench like evidence at a crime scene. The pattern was unmistakable. Arthur hadn't just committed a mistake or a lapse in judgment. He had committed executive fraud. He had knowingly suppressed a legal document and treated my inheritance like his personal slush fund, while simultaneously gaslighting me into believing I was the family failure. At the very bottom of the folder, I found a handwritten note from Beatrice, written on her signature stationery with the embossed initials. "My little star," it began, "I know the path has been lonely. I know they have tried to make you believe you are small. But a star is only small when seen from a distance. Up close, you are a sun. You are powerful, and you are the only one I trust to carry this flame." I sat in that vault for an hour, the note clutched in my hand. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I wasn't the teacher living paycheck to paycheck because she lacked ambition. I was the rightful owner of a legacy they had tried to bury, and for the first time in my life, I felt the fire Beatrice had seen in me. The shock was gone, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt dangerous. I packed the folder into my bag, the weight of it now feeling like armor rather than a burden. As I walked out of the vault, Thomas, the bank manager, was waiting. He didn't ask what I had found. He just looked at my face and gave a small, knowing nod. "I have the contact information for Penelope," he said softly, handing me a business card. "She's been waiting for your call, Grace. She was your grandmother's closest friend and her most trusted legal counsel. She knows everything." I took the card and walked out into the bright, unforgiving morning sun. The city looked different. My father's office building loomed in the distance, a monument to the lies he had built. He thought he had won. He thought he had silenced Beatrice and kept me in my corner. But he had forgotten that you can only push someone into the shadows for so long before they learn how to see in the dark. I wasn't going back to my apartment to cry. I was going to find Penelope, and then I was going to show Arthur Sterling exactly what happens when you try to dim a star that was meant to burn. I stood in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes, clutching a manila folder that contained the systematic destruction of my father's reputation. I had $4.7 million in stolen dreams in my hands, and proof that Arthur had turned my life into a calculated lie while he siphoned my inheritance to fund my brother's lifestyle. The betrayal was absolute, but the mystery remained. Why had my grandmother Beatrice waited 6 years to give me the key? If you have ever been the black sheep of a family that was actually a pack of wolves in sheep's clothing, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Your support means everything to those of us who are finally finding our voice. And please share in the comments. What would you do if you found out your entire family had been living a lie at your expense? I am here, and I am listening to every word you have to say. I drove straight to the address on the business card Thomas had given me. Penelope's office was located in a converted brownstone on a quiet tree-lined street. It was the kind of place that whispered about old money and absolute discretion. As I climbed the stone steps, my heart was hammering against my ribs, so hard it was difficult to breathe. I was no longer just the daughter who rescued hawks for a living. I was a woman carrying a live grenade, and I needed to know how to pull the pin. Penelope met me at the door herself. She was a silver-haired woman in her early 70s, with eyes so sharp they seemed to look right through my skin to the truth underneath. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and a string of pearls that looked like they had been in her family for generations. She did not ask who I was. She simply looked at the folder under my arm and gave a small, sad smile. "I have been waiting for this call for 6 years. Grace," she said, her voice steady and warm. "Your grandmother Beatrice told me you would reach out eventually. I just was not sure when you would be ready." She led me into a sitting room that smelled of peppermint tea and old leather. She poured me a cup with hands that did not shake even for a second. "I was Beatrice's attorney for her personal estate planning," she explained. "I was her friend first and her legal counsel second. Your father, Arthur, controlled the relationship with the family firm, which is why she had to come to me in secret. She knew that if Arthur found out she was changing her will, he would find a way to stop her or declare her incompetent. I opened the folder and laid the documents on the low mahogany table between us. Penelope put on her reading glasses and began to leaf through them. I have copies of everything you found in that bank box, she said, pointing to a secondary file on her desk. I witnessed the 2021 will myself. I notarized it. I have email confirmations from the notary public and both witnesses who were present that day. Your father submitted a version of the will from 2016 to the probate court. In legal terms, Grace, that is called executive fraud. It is a felony. The word fraud hung in the air like a cold mist. My own father had committed a crime against his own daughter to ensure his son Julian had everything. What are my options? I asked. My voice sounded foreign to me, sharp and determined. Penelope set down her teacup and leaned forward. Option 1 is simple. We go to the authorities and file charges. Arthur would face felony charges for fraud and theft. There would be a trial and likely media coverage. He would lose his company, and he might spend time in prison. She paused, watching my reaction. Option 2 is that we confront him directly. We present the evidence and we negotiate a settlement. A full transfer of the trust fund and the Oregon property, plus restitution for every cent he took from you. In exchange, we agree not to pursue criminal charges. I thought about Arthur in a prison cell, and then I thought about him at his country club, surrounded by the judges and business moguls he worshipped. I do not want to destroy him, I said finally. I just want what is mine, and I want him to admit what he did in front of the people who matter to him. Penelope's eyes lit up with something that looked like admiration. A public acknowledgement without public prosecution, she mused. That is difficult to engineer. Unless, of course, there was already a public event where his reputation is on display. That was when I remembered the invitation sitting on my kitchen counter. It was embossed gold on cream cardstock. You are cordially invited to celebrate the 65th birthday of Arthur Sterling. The party was in 3 weeks at the Westbrook Country Club. It was the social event of the season for his circle. My stepmother Evelyn had called me twice to remind me to dress appropriately and not to embarrass the family. I told Penelope about the party. She smiled a thin, cold smile. So she said, you want to give your father a birthday present he will never forget? I want to give him exactly what he deserves in front of the people whose opinions he actually cares about, I replied. Penelope reached for her calendar and circled the date. We have 3 weeks, Grace. We have a lot of work to do. For the next 21 days, I lived a double life. During the day, I worked at the rescue center feeding owls and bandaging broken wings. At night, I was with Penelope rehearsing every word I would say. She coached me on my posture and my tone. Do not raise your voice, she would tell me over and over. Do not cry and do not accuse. Present the facts. Let the papers speak for themselves. Let the numbers tell the story of the theft. We gathered every piece of evidence, notarized affidavits from the witnesses who were already prepared to testify, certified bank records from Thomas, a written statement from the notary who had signed the 2021 will. Penelope even invited the notary and the witnesses to the party as her guests. Arthur wanted a grand celebration of his life and his legacy, and I was going to give it to him. But I was going to show the world that his legacy was built on a foundation of lies and stolen money. The night before the party, I sat in my small apartment looking at the navy blue dress I had chosen. It was simple and elegant. I polished my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only thing she had left me outright that my father could not hide. I felt a strange sense of calm. I was no longer the invisible daughter who was afraid of her father's disapproval. I was Beatrice Sterling's granddaughter, and I was about to step into the light she had always seen in me. I was ready to shine, and the house of Sterling was about to come crashing down. The Westbrook Country Club was a masterclass in artificial perfection. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, amber glow over white-clothed tables, and a jazz quartet played softly near the mahogany bar, their notes blending with the expensive clinking of champagne flutes. Outside, The golf course stretched into the evening mist, green and flawless, looking more like a painting than real earth. I stood at the edge of the ballroom, smoothing the fabric of my navy blue dress. I felt the weight of my grandmother Beatrice's pearl earrings against my skin, the only thing she had left me outright that my father hadn't been able to touch. In my hand, I gripped a slim leather folder containing the systematic destruction of Arthur Sterling's carefully curated world. I watched my father stand at the center of a circle of admirers, accepting birthday wishes like a king receiving tribute. He looked every inch the successful, self-made man. His tie was knotted with surgical precision, and his Patek Philippe watch caught the light every time he gestured, a brilliant flash of gold that felt like a mockery of everyone else's hard work. I heard him tell a cluster of business moguls that he had built everything from nothing. No handouts, just vision and grit. It was a lie he had told so often he clearly believed it himself. Evelyn glided over to me, her Cartier bracelet glinting as she reached out to pat my arm. Her eyes scanned my dress with a look of faint relief. "You actually look appropriate, Grace," she whispered, her voice dripping with that familiar, syrupy condescension. "Your father is about to give his toast. Try to look supportive. Don't stand in the corner like you did at your grandmother's funeral." She swept away before I could respond, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. Arthur took the microphone from the bandleader, tapping it twice to command the room's attention. The 80 guests went silent, their faces turned toward him with practiced admiration. 65 years, he began, his voice warm and resonant. 65 years of building, of growing, and of honoring the legacy of those who came before us. He raised his glass, his gaze sweeping over the room until it landed on Julian, who beamed with unearned pride. "I also had my mother, Beatrice Sterling," he continued, his tone softening into a calculated, nostalgic vibrato. "She was the strongest woman I ever knew. She taught me that family is a business to be tended, and that our legacy is carried forward by those who truly understand its value." He gestured toward Julian. "To the next generation of Sterlings who carry Beatrice's spirit in their veins." The room erupted in applause. Arthur looked around, his smile perfectly calibrated. "And to my daughter Grace," he added, his eyes briefly flicking to mine with a cold, dismissive glint, "who has found her own quiet path in life." A few people looked at me with vague, sympathetic smiles, as if my life were a consolation prize for someone who couldn't handle the real world. The room drank. I didn't. I stepped forward, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. "Dad," I called out, my voice steady and clear enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "May I say a few words about Grandma?" The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur's smile didn't waver, but I saw his jaw tighten. He couldn't refuse. Not in front of Judge Morrison, not in front of his board of directors. "Of course, Grace," he said, gesturing toward the microphone with a flourish of false generosity. "Family should always speak on these occasions." I walked onto the small stage. The heat of the spotlights felt like a spotlight on the truth. "Thank you, Dad," I said, leaning into the microphone. "And happy birthday." My grandmother Beatrice was the most important person in my life. She taught me to read, she taught me to be brave, and most importantly, she taught me to keep careful records. I opened the leather folder. Something shifted in the room. The air seemed to grow thin. "I recently came into possession of some documents Beatrice left specifically for me," I said, pulling out the certified copies, including her final will and testament executed in March 2021, not the 2016 version that was submitted to the probate court. According to this legally binding document, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I was meant to inherit a trust fund valued at $3.5 million and the coastal property in Oregon. I was not meant to receive the $15,000 for a used car that my father claimed was my entire inheritance. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Arthur stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of ashen. "Grace, this is clearly a mistake," he hissed, trying to reclaim the microphone. "You're upset, and this isn't the place for family matters." I didn't move. I pulled out the bank statements Penelope had verified. "I think it is exactly the place, Dad. Especially since these records show that over $450,000 was withdrawn from my trust fund over the last few years. withdrawals that correspond exactly to Julian's tuition payments and your own business investments. Julian stood up, his face white. "That's insane," he shouted. "Dad paid for everything." I kept my eyes on Arthur. "You told me Beatrice died disappointed in me," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal level. "You told me she thought I was a failure, so you could justify stealing the security she left for me." "Richard," a woman's voice called out from the back. It was authoritative and calm. Penelope stood up from her table, her silver hair shimmering under the chandeliers. "I was Beatrice Sterling's personal attorney, and I witnessed that 2021 will myself. She was in full command of her faculties. And she knew exactly what you were planning to do, Arthur." Arthur looked like he wanted to bolt, but he was trapped by the very audience he had invited to witness his greatness. Judge Morrison rose from his seat, his expression grim. "Arthur, if what these documents suggest is true, you are looking at executive fraud," he said, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "That is a felony. I stood on that stage, holding the truth in my hands, and watched my father's world collapse in slow motion. He no longer looked like a king. He looked small, a man drowning in a sea of his own lies. I didn't feel the rush of revenge I thought I would. I only felt the warmth of the light Beatrice had always seen in me, a light that was finally, after 6 years, shining bright enough for the whole world to see." The fallout from the birthday party was swift and devastating. In the 2 weeks that followed, the world of Arthur Sterling did not just crack. It dissolved into a pile of ash and broken promises. My father, the man who had always loomed so large in my mind as a powerful patriarch, was suddenly facing the cold, hard reality of an official investigation for executive fraud. Penelope, with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen every trick in the book, laid out the terms with a surgical precision that left him no room to maneuver. Arthur had a choice. He could face a public trial, a felony conviction, and the very real possibility of years behind a set of iron bars, or he could sign the papers. He chose his reputation, or what little was left of it. He signed over the remaining $3.5 million in the trust fund immediately. He transferred the deed to the Oregon villa back into my name, a property he had told everyone was sold years ago. He also had to pay back the $450,000 he had stolen to fund Julian's life, plus interest. It was a settlement that effectively drained his personal accounts and left his real estate business in tatters. If you are still with me, and this story of standing up for the truth has resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It means more than you know to share these journeys of resilience with people who might be going through their own silent battles. And please, tell me in the comments, have you ever had to set a boundary that felt impossible, but changed your life for the better? I read every single one of your stories, and they remind me why we must never stay quiet about what we deserve. Now let me tell you what happened to the family I once thought I knew. The consequences of Arthur's greed rippled outward like a shockwave. Within a month, 3 of his major business partners pulled out of their deals. If he can rob his own daughter, I heard one of them tell a reporter, who else is he cheating? His carefully polished legacy was gone, replaced by the label of a man who betrayed his own blood. Evelyn filed for divorce 4 months later. She was never one to stay on a sinking ship, and she took half of what he had left before moving to a condo in the city. Then there was Julian, my half-brother, the golden boy who had lived his life on a throne built with my stolen inheritance. He reached out to me 6 months after the party. We met at a neutral coffee shop downtown. He looked different, tired, and the easy arrogance was gone. "I did not know, Grace," he told me, his voice barely a whisper. He said the money was from a family investment. "I never thought to ask why you were left with nothing." I studied him, a 24-year-old finally learning the weight of a dollar. He told me he was taking out loans to finish his final semester. He was not asking for money. He was asking for a chance to be different from our father. I told him that while I would not forget the past, I was willing to see who he became when he finally had to earn his own way. As for me, I did not stay in the city. I packed my small apartment and drove toward the coast of Oregon. The drive was long, But for the first time in 31 years, I felt like I was moving toward a future I had chosen for myself. When I pulled up to the colonial house with the wraparound porch, the smell of salt air and pine needles hit me like a memory I had been holding my breath for. I sat on that porch and read my grandmother Beatrice's letter one more time. I carry it with me every day, a reminder that I was loved unconditionally by the one person who truly mattered. I did not quit my work. A lot of people thought I was crazy to stay in wildlife conservation when I had millions in the bank. Why are you still bandaging wings and cleaning cages? They would ask. But that is the thing about money. It does not buy what you love. It buys you the freedom to do what you love without the soul-crushing weight of living paycheck to paycheck. I used a portion of the trust to set up the Beatrice Sterling Conservation Fund, which provides scholarships for young students who, like me, were told their passions were not worth a career. This journey has taught me 3 things that I want to leave you with today. First, silence is not always a sign of weakness. For years, I believed my inability to scream at my father meant I was a coward. But sometimes, silence is just waiting. It is the quiet act of gathering your strength, collecting your evidence, and learning the terrain before you step onto the battlefield. When I finally spoke, I did not need to shout because the truth was loud enough on its own. Second, you do not owe forgiveness to people who have never asked for it. We are often told that we must forgive to move on. But boundaries are not an act of cruelty. They are an act of clarity. They are the line that says, "This is where I end and your toxicity begins." Knowing that is not betraying your family, it is honoring yourself. And finally, the people who truly love you will protect you in ways you cannot see until you are ready. Beatrice knew I was not ready at 25. She trusted me to find my own voice first, and then she gave me the tools to use it. If there is someone in your life who believes in you, hold on to that faith. It lives on long after they are gone. I am Grace Sterling, and I survived my parents. I am no longer an invisible daughter or a family disappointment. I am a woman who stood in the light and reclaimed her name. If you want to hear more stories of people who found their voices and fought back against the odds, there are several more linked in the description below. Watch them, share them, and remember that your story is never over until you say it is. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video.